All right. I'm going to go back to my screen here, everyone. There we go. So, seeing the way she speaks of her connection with spirit and is able to not only see, but she describes in very clear detail about what she is seeing, how she is seeing, her physical experience of that, as well as the content of the visions themselves. She has three major treatises uh, explaining and then expounding upon the visions that she sees, and they are massive works. But as we know, we're here to really dive into some musical works, and so I'm hoping to overlay her musical works with her life and her biography, her own timeline here. Okay. So, as she is born in 1098, she is born as the 10th child to noble parents, and it was a highly common practice that, as a part of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, you would tithe. And to tithe means to give 10% of your worldly goods. For her parents, that meant dedicating their 10th child to the church. So this was very clear. There was no real argument or lack of understanding that this was a calling. Whether that was for or against her will, we don't really know. She never really says. But it's certainly, it was what was fated for her. And at the age, and there's a couple of indiscrepancies in the age of how she's moving through these early years. It is suggested that by age 8, she is placed with a mentor, Jutta of Sponheim, who is not much older than her, who is a holy woman and has already dedicated herself to the church. There's some family connections between Jutta and Hildegard. They're, as I mentioned, of noble lineage, and throughout their lives, their families are intertwined and engaged in political and sort of power uh, connectivity, I should say. So she is destined for the church. She comes under the wing of Jutta, who she says teaches her the Psalter, which means she's learning Latin, which was crucial to understand anything going on within the church. And then it's supposed that about age 14, Hildegard and Jutta, and it's supposed that there are other young women with them, undergo what is akin to a funeral rite, where they are dedicated to a monastery, to the church, via a monastery at Disibodenberg, the Mount of St. Disibode. Disibode being a local saint of this area of the Rhine Valley. And my friends, it is here where I tend to insert myself a little bit in the narrative, sort of being a fly on the wall. What must it have been like for a 14-year-old to literally be walled in to an anchorage, to a place where they are literally in a cell attached to a church with not anywhere else to go. So the thing about this amazing scene is that she's no longer, and I believe this is important, she's no longer part of the outside world, but she really enters this inner sanctum. And I think a lot about this and what it must be like in terms of her emotional life, her intellectual life, her spiritual life. But I see this part of her biography as vital and important to help us inform how we might understand her creative life too. So we can leave that up to the imagination, but I think it's a beautiful thing to contemplate and wonder about. So now Hildegard is part of this church at the Dizzy-Bodenberg, and I want to fast forward here. I'm going to come back to this, but I want to give you a little sort of time and place here. So we said 1098 she was born. Here is Bingen am Rhein, this the place where she ends up, Bingen. Please note, Hildegard was not born in Bingen. She transfers throughout her life to the area near Bingen, but she was born in a smaller place named Bermersheim, which is very close. An easy car ride. Let's put it that way. But I wanted to show you a picture here of the ruins of Dizzy-Bodenberg. As I mentioned, the Mount Berg of Dizzy-Bod. Sidebar, that this area in Germany was very fertile ground in the very early Middle Ages just a moment, everyone. I'm just going to pull out of my screen share for a sec. To allow someone to join us. So this area of the Rhine Valley was, as I mentioned, fertile ground for the Irish and Celtic peregrini. So monks from the Celtic lands that came across the continent and settled in Central Europe. And if you were at all part of Aya's Brigid project, or you're at all familiar with saints of Celtic origin, Dizzy-Bod was one of the peregrini. He settled here. The place that Hildegard eventually ends up and founds her own monastery, the Mount of St. Rupert. Rupert, too, was an Irish peregrini from overseas. I think that's fascinating. So, that said, imagine we're at the Dizzy-Bodenberg, and as part of a monastic culture, you have one thing that is very much for sure. You are living and breathing the liturgy, hour by hour and day by day. The Dizzy-Bodenberg was of the order of St. Benedict. This was under Benedictine rule, which meant that any adherents of this rule literally followed the rule. And maybe in a moment I'll grab the book that I have, The Rule of St. Benedict, that I recommend to you, where every aspect of monastic life was very, 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 very clearly spelled out for you, including the punishments if you dared to transgress. Now, of course, everybody transgressed, lest us believe that all these monks and nuns were living spotless lives. No, it's not true. And in fact, Hildegard was very, very much opposed to lax clergy. However, what she learned with Jutta and the other women was the liturgy. And this was also going to inform her musical life, her singing life. Yeah. We have no idea. Hildegard never actually talks about singing, but she does talk about sound and music. So one of the things I wanted to do was to introduce us first to a very simple Gregorian chant. And I want to be able to set that up so that we can then segue into hearing some of Hildegard's music. So that said, I'm going to bring us back to this slide here. I would love to set up, as I mentioned, a very simple chant. This is the Ave Regina Caelorum, which is a Marian song. It's one of 4 Marian hymns that actually finish each, at the end of each Compline service. Compline would have been the last prayer service of each day in the monastery, and that this chant would have been heard during, I believe, it is, I'm going to make a mistake, but I think it's around February 1st. I think it's the time of February 1st to Lent, through Lent. So I'm going to just grab my harp here. We have instruments and voices for you today, everybody. So this is my little Gothic harp. I'm just going to give myself a little tonal center, and I invite you to follow along. It's okay if you can't read this. But what you could do is follow the text or follow the music. It's up to you. Ave Regina Celorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve Radix, Salve Porta, ex qua mundo lux est orta, Gaude Virgo gloriosa, super omnes speciosa, Vale, o valde decora, et pro nobis Christum exora. So you hear a syllabic, what we would call pneumatic melody, simple in scope. Syllabic, you see how there's one syllable for most of these notes, and the notes are called neumes, N-E-U-M-E. And neum is a Greek word, and it actually means breath or breathe, which is a really wonderful, wonderful, wonderful way to think about neumes. So here we have a very sort of clean sound world that we're going to then bounce off of. And now I'd like to bring us into Hildegard's world here and have a listen to an antiphon dedicated to Saint Ursula. I just want to stop the share for a moment because I always feel like it's a wonderful thing to hear observations, to see or hear or feel or touch anything that struck you in hearing this music alongside the text. You can drop it in the chat too if you want. And I will talk if nobody wants to. Just sort of just keep the river flowing here. The story of Saint Ursula is extremely fascinating. And I don't want to get all the way into it, but Hildegard did, I imagine, the need for lots of breath and oxygen from Amy. Yes. Yes. To find the flow of the music along with the air and the singers. Yes, absolutely. The story of Saint Ursula is a legend that Ursula was a princess in the British Isles who was told by her father that she needed to marry a pagan prince. She was a devout Christian and could not imagine marrying this prince. She begged her father to go on a holy pilgrimage, which he finally did. She goes across to Germany, and as the story goes, as the legend goes, and as the cult was really sort of replenished, refurbished rather, or something like that, at this time, right around the turn of the year 1000, there in Germany, they found this big graveyard, a big grave of bones, and knowing the story of Ursula, that as she progressed along her pilgrimage, thousands and thousands of virgins collected to walk with her and to go on pilgrimage. But what happened? They met Attila the Hun himself, who said, "I will spare your life if you marry me." And of course, what did she say? "No, I will not do that." So he slaughtered everyone at the site. So this was a very, very influential story for Hildegard, who also, in addition to many other things, qualities that she espoused, one of the most important was that of chastity. So looking at Hildegard and all of the virgin maidens, 11,000, as the legend goes, virgins, that held up the standard of Christianity and chastity. So, you hear an antiphon here. I'm going to go back to my share so you can all see that. I'm going to go back to my share just a moment so you can all see that. Here we go. So, what you also hear, and I want to really pull this detail out and start to talk about this very intimate marriage of text and music. Here we have O rubor sanguinis, O redness of blood, and you hear that flowing gesture. I'll play it for you on the piano here. I love this, where we hear Il flow. You hear that beautiful gesture. Imagine this sort of dripping, flowing. What an image. So here I want to think about the text and the music. Because as we hear it, and as I've been reading your comments too, I'm going to just take a look at those. We do hear these symbols being illustrated, yes. I often think about Hildegard's creative process, and to think about, as I mentioned before, all of the inner life that she was living, as we all do, her physical world, and also this rich and deeply profound spiritual world. And to think about how she really received all of this creative output, whether that's through whatever means you can imagine. But I wanted to show this beautiful illumination that Hildegard puts at the very front of her first visionary work, the Scivias. And here you see the seer being inspired, and here we see the red flames entering her brow. That is the Holy Spirit. So to think about receiving a work, a song, and I think about the text and the music, which came first? I'm not sure. I think of them like a DNA double helix, that they are intricately woven. And it's really an extraordinary thing to see how these songs have such a unique character. That said, these songs were also influenced by the chants that she was hearing day in and day out. So there is so much original content and conception, but it's all informed by her spiritual life as a Benedictine in the 12th century too. So it's a beautiful thing to witness and to actually begin to step into the songs and to see what kind of depth they possess. More than just the notes on the page. So, what I have here next to this illumination is actually, I think, one of the most pivotal moments in Hildegard's life that I'd like to talk about, segue into. So as she's living at St. Dizzy-Bodenberg, she has a relatively quiet life, at least on the outside. And things are pretty quiet until she's about 38. And she says that when she was 38, Jutta, who was the magistra, or the abbess of the women that were there at the anchorage, that Jutta dies. There's also stories that she tells about Jutta's nature and being extremely different than Hildegard's nature. Jutta was one who basically felt that purification was through the mortification of the body, and she made extreme measures for the sake of purifying herself. Hildegard, I can only imagine being in the same room all the time with someone that's harming their body. Hildegard did not feel this way at all, and in fact, as we learn throughout her writings, that she saw the human body as something that was to be celebrated, as an instrument of God. And so when Jutta dies, when she's 38, the women in the anchor hold unanimously elect Hildegard to be the next magistra, the next abbess, the next leader. And then we don't hear very much until the writing of this piece, when she's 42, and she's so clear and so detailed about it. And what happens at age 42? Well, she has a prophetic call. And I'd like to read this to you out loud. It happened that in the 1141st year of the incarnation of the Son of God, Jesus Christ, when I was 42 years and 7 months old, heaven was opened, and a fiery light of exceeding brilliance came and permeated my whole brain and inflamed my whole heart and my whole breast, not like a burning, but like a warming flame, as the sun warms anything its rays touch. And immediately I knew the meaning of the exposition of the scriptures, namely the Psalter, the Gospel, and the other Catholic volumes of both the Old and the New Testaments. I had sensed in myself, wonderfully, the power and mystery of secret and admirable visions from my childhood, that is, from the age of 5 up to that time as I do now. I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, "Cry out, therefore, and write thus." So here we have the call to write. Now, what she doesn't say right here is what happened next, which is probably the same reaction that any one of us would have, which is, I don't think so. No thanks. I don't think I can do that. Bear in mind, my friends, that hearing, a call to write as a woman in the church in the 12th century was a sticky business, to say the least. That there were very severe consequences for overstepping, let's say. And I don't mean to be glib here, but I mean to say that this was a very, very tall order indeed. As I think even Professor Newman said, all prophets, say no thank you at first. They're too scared, like all the rest of us. We're scared. So eventually, the Spirit gets through, and a whole new chapter opens. And at age 42, she begins this renaissance. Another sidebar here, my friends. There's a wonderful, wonderful blog called Healthy Hildegard, if you haven't heard of it. And what I love about this blog, it covers lots of different areas. There's many guest writers covering different areas of interest that Hildegard is connected with, including homeopathic remedies and things like that. But they talk a lot about a midlife awakening, which is a really interesting thing to see this in Hildegard and being inspired by Hildegard as this awakening is unfolding. So what happens? She starts to write. And it takes 10 years, but she writes her first visionary treatise. And throughout that time, it's not exactly clear, but we know that her numbers start to expand and that she has now found the courage as well as the support, the steadfast support of that man in that illumination. His name is Volmar, Volmar, who she has known since childhood, who she confided in throughout her life, telling him of these visions. I think Jutta as well also knew. But here you see she's receiving the vision from Spirit. She's writing it down on a wax tablet with a little stylus. I love her footstool so very much. And outside the window is Volmar. So this is an interesting thing to see they're still separated here as they work together. And Volmar was not only a friend and a confidant and her confessor, he was also her secretary and editor. I just imagine best friends. It's good to have a really close friend. Oh my goodness. And so we start to see her visionary work unfold. And there's a fabulous story about how this work was put in front of the Pope himself. And it's through this very important circumstance that she is actually supported by the clergy around her to continue writing. So she finally got the courage and the surrender to divine will to begin writing. But through just this remarkable synchronicities, is really blessed to begin her vocation as a visionary and a writer. So next, we have our very own Kristen. I'd love to get some music in here, who's going to offer us a song, a Marian song. And I'm going to pull it up here, Kristen. So this is a good opportunity to just sort of segue into some talk about the music again. As we heard in the O Rubor Sanguinis, an antiphon, a shorter piece here, an antiphon was a very, very common musical form throughout in monastic life. In the Benedictine rule, the way you organized your week was by reciting all 150 psalms throughout the week. Well, every single psalm had at least one antiphon to accompany it. Usually, often we'd hear numerous antiphons collected with a group of psalms. So the antiphon was very common currency. It was a thing that we heard all the time. Here we see an antiphon for the Virgin. We do not know when this would have been performed or what psalm it was attached to. We just don't know. We do know that it was embedded in only one of two manuscripts. The manuscript that was, we know, was compiled during her lifetime, and I'll talk a little bit about sources in a little while. But I wanted to show you the notation from that source, as you see here. And I'd like to, if that's okay, I'd like to actually have you look at this page as we hear Kristen. I'm going to have to pull myself out of the share for just a moment so I can have access to my cursor. Kristen, I'd like to highlight you. Okay, and then we're going to go back to share. So we can take a look at the Dendermonde Codex, and we'll talk a little bit about this source for a little bit. And here, for Kristen, we're going to bring out the Symphonia here. Virtual droning. Okay. You ready?
Yep. O Frangens virga into Sicutorora procedit nunc gaude et et nos debiles dignare amala consuetudine liberare ad clemonam dom orige ad ericendum
Thank you, Kristen. So here we have that beautiful blossoming branch. And I always think this is such a beautiful piece to talk about poetry and the kinds of images that Hildegard is speaking about here. Just one moment, everybody. I'm going to unspotlight Kristen. Not that we don't want to see your beautiful face at all times. Sorry, everybody. So, what I would like to do is bring us back to our poem. Is that clear for everybody? Okay. So what we begin to see, especially as I mentioned earlier, the special quality that Hildegard perceived in virgins, and very, very much connected with that quality of the Virgin Mary, the Mother of Christ. So often what we see is this comparison with greenness, what a special word that Hildegard talks about is viriditas, or the quality of greenness. It's a beautiful concept. I think there's a couple of things at play here. When we think about the branch, she's at one time talking, yes, about fecund, verdant nature, especially where she lived in the Rhine Valley, but also the tree of Jesse, the lineage of Christ, where the Virgin was a bough upon this very, very noble and important tree. There's also, in my mind, looking at the Virgin as her bringing forth Christ is one of the most sacred creative acts, to bring forth the child of God. And that certainly overlaps with her worldview regarding women as well, as the creatrix. Our bodies bring forth creation. And it's a wonderful thing as you come upon a poem or as a song text to start to really see, gosh, there's so many different layers here. And there's no right or wrong here, but I think it's all going to speak very much to us on an individual level as well. This antiphon is a very sort of standard, sort of poetic, has a standard poetic structure for antiphons, where we start out with this O, like an ode or an invocation to some quality, and then we describe that, and then we say, please pray for us. Very common sort of structure. I'd like to move on, and we'll talk about notation in a little bit. But I wanted to begin to talk a little bit more about Hildegard's works, as we know there are so many of them. And we see here another illumination, which is a very iconic illumination. So under this, brief listing of her works, we see the trilogy of her visionary work. We see the Scivias, Liber Vitae Meritorum, and the Liber Divinum Operum. These are all books of her visions. Then we see two bodies of music. So I definitely want to sort of come back to those. The Symphonia, for short, the Ordo Virtutum, scientific treatises, their other works, this fascinating dictionary that she wrote of her own words. Oh my goodness. And over 300 letters, sermons, the vitae, or biographies basically, of two local saints, Disibode and Rupert, who we spoke of earlier as sort of saints that were associated with the two places where she was living and worshiping, and these visions into illuminations. So people often ask, did Hildegard make these illuminations? It is not supposed that she did, but that she oversaw them. And what you're seeing right now on the screen is actually a contemporary reconstruction. There's a long and interesting history to the manuscript that originally contained these illuminations, which was part of the Scivias, as I said, that first work, 26 visions. And there are some really extraordinary illuminations that she describes in detail. And here we see the Holy Trinity. You see the man in the center is Christ, that glowing golden center is the Father, and that circle all around is that Holy Spirit that encompasses all. And I want you to sort of keep this vision in mind as we look at another song later on. But here we have the body of songs, the two songs that you've heard so far, and all of the songs you've ever heard of Hildegard's, except the Ordo Virtutum, which was yet another maverick thing that she did. She created a play, a morality play, a musical play. It's a fascinating thing. It's not exactly clear why or for what she composed it. The wonderful movie Vision, which we'll be screening as part of our community workshop, there's an amazing scene where they show the nuns playing the different virtues, the play of the virtues in this play, with all of their hair down and jewels and costumes, and may have been performed as a ceremony to consecrate the new convent that she founded. More on that. The Harmonious Music of Heavenly Mysteries. That is an amazing title for your songs. And what we see in the background is another illumination, and this is the symphony that she describes in one of her visions, the symphony of all living things. Now we have another chant, another antiphon for the Virgin. This is sort of our theme for the day. But here I wanted to call upon Crossley to share some music for us. Crossley, just one moment. I'm just going to fiddle for a moment and highlight you. Thanks for your patience, everyone. Okay, and we're going to pull our share screen back. Now this time I'd love for us to follow the text here. So, looking at another really interesting poem. Cross whenever you're ready, my friends. Thank you, Grassley. I going to move your spotlight. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about this music and our accessibility to it. And to be able to sort of understand again the significance of Hildegard's works now as we, in the 21st century, are yes, we're attracted to it, but again, how well preserved it all is. So there are two manuscripts only that contain her music. Knowing how much other output that she had, there are varied and many manuscripts throughout the European continent that contain her visionary works, her scientific works, but only two for the music. And we know them by these names: the Dendermonde Codex, which I think is a really interesting manuscript. It's beautifully, beautifully bound here. It's in Belgium, and it's fairly modest as things go. This manuscript was compiled during Hildegard's lifetime, and that is significant because we know that she oversaw this. She compiled this manuscript as a gift. It was a request by this group of nuns at the Dendermonde Monastery. Gembloux, I believe, is the place in Belgium. They were fascinated by Hildegard. There was one monk who eventually became her secretary later in life after Fulmar passed that sent her tons of letters with a million questions. And it prompted this gift of songs and other religious texts, including religious texts, interestingly, of another visionary of the time, Elizabeth of Schonau. So this is one manuscript. It has not all the songs. There are 77 songs that we have today. There's my beautiful maps. Hold on, we're going to skip ahead to the Reason Codex, which is the second source. Reason Codex is just code for really big book, okay? And it's huge. It's about this big, and it's very, very thick. And this manuscript was compiled. It contains not just her music, but as you see from the side view, it's very extensive, and it contains all three of her visionary treatises, many, many, many other works, as well as the majority of the Symphonia and the Ordo Virtutum. All that music is tucked in the back, by the way. And so here, I love this picture of this manuscript. You also see the chain, as my friend Karen, who's on this call, who's a book conservator in other days, also talked about this chain being something that would keep the book chained to the shelves. Correct me if I'm wrong, Karen. So that's a modern addition. But this binding is just gorgeous. And here we see that the range of this manuscript was still in the 12th century, but it was after Hildegard's passing. Hildegard died in 1179. And so at the time of her death, all of this was compiled in support of her beatification and eventual canonization. Well, she was beatified in the 14th century, but she was not canonized until the 20th century. It's a really long story, and I wonder why. Things just got shuffled around, or politics, or who knows. But here are the two main sources. And as we saw in the case of the Dendermonde Codex, my friends, this is a miracle, in my opinion, that this music is so beautifully preserved. And I'd love to just talk about this score for a second. What we have here in the 12th century, so let's say if this is the Dendermonde Codex that was compiled around 1175-ish, 1174. So Scivias was composed between 1141 and 1151. So this is about 20 years after the Scivias. Is that the right math? Yes. We don't know when this song would have been composed. It may have been a much earlier song. We don't know. There are songs that she places in the Scivias that there are music for. There is no music in the Scivias, just the texts of the songs. So what we have here is a kind of musical notation called Hofnagel, which means horse nail, and you will immediately see why it has that very sweet name, Hofnagel notation. It was a regional variant, and notation was pretty hot stuff at this time, and I'm going to give you the quickest music notation lesson ever. Guido of Arezzo, born around 1000, was really the pioneer of musical notation. He invented the staff, okay? Before the staff, we had those very neumes that we spoke of earlier that you see here. But because if, say, you were a monk at, say, St. Gall or Metz, you knew exactly what chants you needed for this service at this time of year, and it was all very inclusive, that music was used for your community. And anyone coming in from the outside had no idea what you were doing, unless it was a major, major chant that was very widespread. But there was a lot of regional activity here. So, what happens with the advent of the staff, all of a sudden, some person's neumes that were maybe a mnemonic device to help them, oh yeah, it's Easter. This is the inventory for da-da-da. Now, a monk could take his, say, inventory and go to another place and say, this is how our chant goes, because I can show you what the pitches are. So the staff is a technology that fostered a stable pitch center, okay? It gave us relative pitch. So before the staff, you just maybe had a line that went this, and then a couple of dots, and then a line that went like this, and then this, and then this. So you only had these very loose sort of neumes. Some meant go up, some meant go down. And then you just kind of filled in the details. So now, what are we looking at here? We have the 4-line staff that Guido invented. And here you see, I wonder if, no, my cursor won't work, but you see there's a red line along that staff. That red line is your F. And then 2 lines above it, you have a little C. And that is your clef. That's your C clef. That tells you where C is. Now here in the Dendermonde Codex and in the Riesen Codex, as F is red, C, it's not super clear here. It's clear in the Riesen Codex, but it's yellow. It has a yellow overlay. So you always know where you are. Now that's sad. As modern performers, we are not beholden to this pitch as absolute. If I'm gonna just play this, there's that. That's wrong, excuse me. So here we see some neumes. We can now tell exactly what pitches we're on. Now interpreting the neumes is a whole other conversation, which is fascinating and amazing. And if you want to learn, you can learn next week with us. More on that later. So here we have pitch center, but here Hildegard in this sort of school of notation, she is not taking on what Guido invented, which was square notation. If you remember, early on we did the Ave Regina Caelorum, that had little square neumes. Thank you, Guido, for inventing the square notation and the staff. But here, how interesting, we're keeping these neumes that are their own living, breathing language. Okay? And I always like to think that when Hildegard, as we saw in that beautiful image of her receiving her visions, and we think about the text and the music being interwoven, that the neumes were part of that language too. That there's really just this intricate layer cake. And that all of these neumes very, very specifically chosen and have interpretive qualities. It's going back. So this is one important piece of the timeline that I definitely want to share with you, because I think it's a really impactful thing that happens to Hildegard, and especially along the span of her output. So around the time she's engaged in writing the Scivias, she has another vision and a call that says it's time to leave Dizzy-Bodenberg and find your own place, to remove the sisters and start a new convent. And the capsule story goes that the monks, especially the abbot at Dizzy-Bodenberg, thought this was a terrible idea for so many reasons. And in fact, the nuns that were at Dizzy-Bodenberg, many of whom also thought this is a terrible idea. For one thing, a lot of the women that were flocking to this place because of Holy Hildegard were other noble ladies. They brought dowries with them. They brought their worldly resources to support the whole monastery, the whole organism of the monastery. So now we have a bit of resistance on the part of the clergy. I'll fast forward, though, that after much debate and much argument, Hildegard finally gets permission to go. And she goes up the road, as you see on my Google map here. She goes up the road with a small group of nuns. I think it's about 15 or so. She secures the lands. So this is so savvy, so that the new settlement is only hers, only the property of the women that live there. She, after much dispute, also secures Volmar to come be their confessor. And they establish a new site at the Rupertsberg. And the rest is history, my friends. A whole new chapter is revealed here. So here, as you see in this satellite image, you see the Rhine River running through the center. You see that little star, the site of the Rupertsberg. It's now a train station. There's no more Rupertsberg. And what you also see in the upper right corner of that image is a daughter house, the house at Bingen. So we see now the namesake of Hildegard. This is the new place. This is Bingen. And that daughter house was also founded. It was a spillover house. There were so many women that came to populate this place. I can only imagine how beautiful and vital it must have been. But the other interesting thing here, as you see not only the spread of her works and her leadership, I should mention that the daughter house was destroyed during the 30 Years' War, but it was rebuilt in the 19th century and is still there today. So if you ever want to go on pilgrimage, there is a place to go, and it is so on my bucket list. But you see this verdant landscape. Remember that notion of viriditas. This was a time when she was really connecting with the earth around her. This was a time when she was developing scientific treatises. She talked about every type of fish that she could find in the Rhine, all of their healing properties and elements. She talks about gemstones and their healing properties. There's so much that is connected with the land and the earth, this beautiful earth around her. I love that beautiful castle in the foreground too. This Rhine Valley, so rich with farms and vineyards. And here is, I'm not going to sing this whole song for you, everybody. I just want to give you a little taste of this. This is hands down my favorite song of Hildegard's, and really sort of espouses this notion of greenness, viriditas. I'm going to sing a little bit, and what I'd also like to do is, I'm only going to sing a little bit, but really bring your awareness to all of the symbols, all of the images that are coming through this text. As we spoke earlier about the placement of something like this, again, hands in the air, I have no idea. And especially hearing the contrast of this antiphon, certainly with the other three that you've heard prior to this. That's all I'll say. Just a little flavor of that earthy chants. Now moving on here. I think I'm looking at the time, and I am going to pass through this last chant. But as you see here, we have an image from the Reason Codex, and similar setup here as the Dendermonde, where you see the staff, you see that red line, and here more clearly the yellow line of that C. Now here in the second line, she also puts an F, or rather maybe Volmar puts in a little F, so there's some other information there. But moving on, here is an antiphon for divine wisdom. And what I see in this chant is something, this is one of the chants that I used this, 2 weeks ago. We have this on our YouTube page where you can see the music and you can download a transcription of this on our website. But the reason I think this is such a great piece to teach is that it shows this clear-cut sort of form, as I mentioned, of the antiphon. You have that invocation, you have that middle section of sort of description, and then a final prayer. And here we talk about divine wisdom as an entity that brings life to all things, that it has 3 wings, and it circles everywhere. So here it's like this thing that encompasses the Trinity, but it also acts like the Holy Spirit. There's a number of really, really profound images and very unclear images too. But what you do see is something that's very characteristic of Hildegard, where she's personifying this entity, if you will, wisdom being a feminine entity. Barbara Newman calls them goddesses. So it's a very, very beautiful chant. I encourage you to go and learn it if you are interested. And oh my goodness, I think that is the end. I'm just making sure that we didn't forget anything, everybody. Okay. I did want to show you this illumination one more time. In the poem O Virtus Sapientiae, she talks about divine wisdom encompassing all things. You circled circling. When I think about this image, I see that Holy Spirit encompassing the Father and the Son, that there's a spatial quality to this. And I think as we look at the illuminations, obviously they're rendered in 2D. And it's funny, we think about music as 2D because we see it on a page, right? But this music, these visions, our experiences are nothing like 2D experiences. And one of the things I love to talk about when we harken back to medieval music is that it can seem 2D. Especially when we sort of put it up on a pedestal. It's so far away and it's so high above us. But in fact, I think it's through the music of Hildegard, through experiencing that music, whether through listening or singing or being a container for this music, that it becomes such a rich experience. It's a tapestry of experience, not just through the intellect, through reading the neumes, through understanding the notes or hearing something or reading something on a line, but that it's experiential and extremely personal in that regard too. And so here, my friends, we see throughout the end of her life, as the ongoing work continues, there's nothing except advances and opening and expansion into life throughout the second half of her life. And she lives until, I believe, she's 76. I could be wrong. Something like that. I'll have to double check. But it's here. I'm going to take away this share and bring us all back. And I'm going to unhighlight myself if I can. And I would absolutely like to start to open this awesome floor open. Okay, so what I'm going to suggest is that we wave our hands or throw something in the chat. So here we go. Oh my gosh, so everyone, I haven't been able to see your chat because I would get too distracted, but I can't wait to read all of this. And I'm going to work backwards here. So if you have a question, I'm going to ask Kristen or Crossley to just keep your eye open, and maybe could you just sort of open that up. So Saffron, can you recommend a translation of the harmonious music of Heavenly Mysteries? Yes, I can, Saffron. It's a translation by Barbara Newman. It's simply called the Symphonia, and it has all 77 songs translated both literally and poetically by herself. And she actually speaks about this in that talk that she gave last week. Oh yes, thank you. So it is a seminal work. It's really quite extraordinary. It is my most beloved book. Yes. Marilyn, sound resonance is the third dimension? No, I don't think so. I think it's like the 10th dimension. Oh my goodness, Jen, steeped in the senses. Yes, I agree, Jen. And I think that's absolutely something that is part of the experience. The poetry, the images, and as I mentioned too, it's like not just pulling ourselves back in time like in a Mandalorian from Back to the Future, but to actually inhabit the same space. Oh my goodness, Karen, our book expert. I'm going to read this out loud. It's in the chat because I want to read it out loud. In early libraries, books were attached to their bookshelf by a chain as a deterrent against theft. The chain was fitted to a book's front cover at the foredge opposite the spine via a ringlet and was long enough for a book to be removed from its shelf, but not removed from the library. And the other end of the chain was attached around a rod that ran horizontally along the length of the shelf, I assume at the back of the shelf. And the librarian would use a key to remove the chain. Cool. Thanks, Karen. Does anyone have any questions for myself, or Kristen, or Crossley? Leslie, go ahead and unmute yourself, Leslie.
Well, I have really loved this webinar, coming as a person who didn't know very much about Hildegard, but enjoyed her music a lot. And I'll never think of Hildegard the same way again. It has enhanced my appreciation so much. The all of the phrases having to do with the perfection of the Virgin, and she was described as being divine, really. Was that, which I think is partly because women, didn't have any, they, in the Trinity, there wasn't a woman. So they just invented a fourth element, perhaps. But was there any thought given, or how do I say this? Did the hierarchy of the church resent the fact that they upheld the Virgin so highly? Did anybody feel threatened by that?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
And in fact, I think the Virgin took on a great mantle, if you will. I think there's so many centuries of theological dispute and debate that have very clear views, or at least in the end stated clear views about the nature of woman, the nature of the Virgin. But I think Hildegard speaks very clearly about the Virgin as the most beautiful and blessed. And it's very interesting to also see her sort of counter that with Eve. So it's a complicated relationship. But as we also talked about, the nature of virginity, that virginity was what also brought them so closely aligned with Mary. And being the vessel of God. Yeah, so which meant they were closer to God through their virginity. Yeah. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Oh my goodness. So I'm going to say, yes, the divine feminine, Jen. Oh, you're welcome, Laura. Jenny, some would say upholding the Virgin also served to keep other women in their place, but get the sense in Hildegard's writing that other women are valued more. Indeed. Any other questions? Or thoughts or observations? Is anyone inspired to go sing some Hildegard? Oh, yes. Jen, I'm so taken. Yes, it's such a beautiful song. It's so amazing. It's the O Firidissima Virga has I like to think that it has a sort of folk quality too. I think we think a lot about this music as it would have been presented in the liturgy in church. But yes, Carolyn. But knowing that we don't know about where songs like this would fit within the span of a liturgy, it's interesting to think about how inspiration led Hildegard to create works that maybe were outside of that. We're just songs for joy, for praise. Who knows? Who knows? Maybe it was also sung on Friday night. and then they had cookies. I don't know. So it's hard to know. We don't know. There's a lot of questions and a lot of mystery, and it was 900 years ago, but it feels so real, which is also a really interesting quality. Yeah. Any other questions? And you can ask me anytime. Just drop me a note. The last thing I would leave you with is that if you are interested in joining us, we are having a workshop where, oh my God, one of my, more than just talking about Hildegard is singing Hildegard. So it's also singing Hildegard from the original notation. So we're going to spend 6 weeks learning some songs in the original notation, far away, all spread across the globe. So you're welcome to join us, and I'll send emails about that. And to be able to maybe tap into our 10th dimension of sound, even on Zoom. Who knew? Yes. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Please reach out if you have any more questions, and I'm really, really delighted that you joined us. And we will have this as a private link on YouTube, so you can watch again and catch up or hear something again if you missed it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks, Karen, Amy, Jen. You're welcome, everybody. And if you have any other questions, feel free to ask them too if you want to stay.